Right, I'll kick off. Welcome everybody to the Developer versus Programmer webinar. This is something Chris and I have spoken about probably over the last year.
More than that, I think. Just
yes.
This kind of idea, and it's one that I did a while ago, and we've talked about it, and oh yes, we really should do that. And then obviously lockdown occurred, and then now we're out of lockdown, and then I changed jobs, and then other things happened. So, but after all that, here we are. I just hope it's worth the wait.
So Chris is a fellow of the institution, and he seems to have got around quite a lot. I notice he's worked with the UK Parliament, which is quite good. The EU Parliament, with Sony and Facebook. They're just the first four I think I saw on his list, and then some TV channels. So you've obviously been going around quite well.
Yeah, I've done lots of mad stuff in my time, you know.
So the general format for those that haven't attended is Chris will do his presentation, which will be less than 2 hours. Well, usually about 20 minutes, and then we open it up to a Q&A session at the end. Oh, look at these people throwing themselves into it. There'll be a Q&A session at the end where people can ask questions, and what we tend to do, we record this and then we edit it down, and we'll put it on our YouTube channel. So if people want to, we have people who can't attend today who want to see it so they can catch up, and then for other people who just want to go back through it again. So we'll do all that. What I would say is if people could turn off their video and turn off their microphones, but not Chris, because he's presenting.
Well, I was going to say I can if you want to, but the presentation will be very short.
And if people do join late, or people are joining in their droves. So yeah, as people join, if they can turn off their video and turn off their microphones. And then obviously that won't interfere with Chris's presentation. So not interrupt the presentation. If I see people who haven't muted, I will mute them. But I tend to let people mute themselves. So I will say nothing else. I will hand you over to Chris, and please enjoy.
Thank you very much. I hope so. So, programmer versus developer. So a little bit about me first, just so you know, because I don't think most of you know me, so I could just be some random guy off the street. So you know, I just thought I'd give myself a little bit of an introduction. So as John said, I am a fellow of the Institution of Analysts and Programmers. I mean, my father was too, so there's a bit of family history there. And so what this is going to be about, I'm going to give you a bit of context, a bit of history, then kind of talk about, you know, what I think is the difference between programmer and developer, and also kind of touching on software engineer as well. And then at the end, give a summary. So that's me. My beard's grown a lot since then, but that's the kind of best pitch that I could find. So obviously my name's Chris Mercer. Right now I manage a team of software engineers for a company called Kerber. It's a new AI machine learning team, so it's quite fun. Right now the team consists of me, so my first role is to recruit a team, so that's currently a lot of fun. So I've been a developer for around 20 years, give or take. I've been an amateur programmer for over 30 years, since I was like 4 or 5, so that's like nearly like 40 years, unfortunately. As I said, and as John said, I'm a fellow of the Institution of Analysts and Programmers. I'm also a chartered engineer, European engineer, chartered professional member of the BCS. I graduated from Plymouth University back in 2001, and I do actually have a stutter, so if the audio sounds like it's breaking up, that might not be your connection, it might just be me, so do bear with me. I'll kind of get there eventually. So I know that, I mean, we should all know this, given that we're here. for the institution of analysts and programmers, but I do just like to touch on this. So its mission is improving software for society. So from my point of view, software is throughout everybody's lives. So it is incumbent upon us as software professionals to make it as useful for society as we can. I think it's an ethical and moral obligation, but that's a whole kind of another discussion which I may do in the future. Perhaps it will be in another few years. So the aim of the IAP is to become the leading specialist professional body worldwide, recognising the competence of those engineers in all aspects of software development, and to ensure that its members adhere to the highest professional standards, are committed to their own development, and abide by their duty to serve the public interest in their work, and so on. For more information or to join, if you're not already members, it's iap.org.uk. And yeah, so a bit of context. Now, this is entirely my own opinion, so feel free to ignore it, because I'm just just a guy who writes software and runs teams that write software. I'm not anyone special or anything. I've tried to back up my opinion with facts, but it's not always possible. I'm definitely not here to preach. This is definitely more of a thought experiment more than anything else. So why bother? It's a good question, but I do hope that in kind of having this little thought experiment, it will kind of help you to think about your skills, your expertise, where you see yourself going in the software industry. As I say, it's such an important industry these days. It touches all of our lives in some very surprising way sometimes. So we do need good people in the software industry, and I think that people who are self-reflective tend to be better developers. So first, we're going to go through a little bit of history about the first term which came about, which was programmer. So who was considered to be the first programmer? Just in case you don't know, I would argue Ada Lovelace. So that's a portrait of her. So we're talking about 1815 to 1862. So I don't know that they had cameras back then, so a portrait's as good as we're going to get. So she was the only legitimate child of Lord Byron, the Lord Byron, the poet, and his wife, Lady Wentworth. She was often quite ill, so she would kind of stay in bed and kind of learn about maths. As aristocrats tend to be, they were presented at court. She was presented at court at the age of 17 and became acquaintances with some big names, some of whom you may recognise, such as Michael Faraday, Charles Dickens, Charles Babbage, who she met through her maths tutor, Mary Somerville. Now, Charles Babbage, you could say that he probably built the first kind of computer. I'm obviously talking big brushstrokes here because there's a few arguments either way, but just for the sake of this, so he created the difference engine, which was, say, arguably the first ever computer, and he was invited to give a seminar at the University of Turin. So a spectator transcribed the lecture into French, and the spectator asked Ada to translate it into English, which she did. However, she actually made some more notes, which were added to the translation. So one of her notes, called Note G, she described an algorithm using the difference engine to compute Bernoulli numbers, and thus programming was born. So the difference engine looks a bit like that. It's a replica. You can view it in the Science Museum in London, and it's very, very interesting to see where the whole computer thing came from. And Ada's notes were published, which look a bit like this. Now, I'm no mathematician, so I don't know what I'm looking at, but it looks quite cool. So what is the Bernary number? As I said, not a mathematician, no idea, but it's got its own Wikipedia page, so therefore it's probably quite difficult and important, right? Ada itself is now a programming language. It's one that I learned in my final year of my degree. It looks very kind of Pascal-y, but it's very, very strict. It's used to either build software that's used to either kill a lot of people or save a lot of lives is the old anecdote, because it's the kind of software that was used to program nukes and also to program aircraft. Whether that's the case or not now, I'm not entirely sure, but yes, Ada, the programming language, is named after her. So that's where the term programmer came from. So what about developer? Well, before we get to developer, first the term software engineer was coined. And let's talk about that. So the cogs and levers in the difference engine gave way to electronic computers. So there was one called ENIAC, which became the first electronic computer in 1945, and it had 17,000 vacuum tubes, weighed more than 30 tons, and it was used by US government programs to develop hydrogen bombs. So software engineer, as far as I can tell, was first used in an open letter from the Association for Computing Machinery, written by the president, Anthony Ottinger, I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, to the membership of the ACM in 1965 in this paragraph here. As you can see, be it hardware engineering or software engineering, a profession without artificial and irrelevant boundaries between scientific and business applications. So as I say, as far as I can tell, that's the first time that it was coined. Other times where it's been used, so Margaret Hamilton was the director of the software engineering division of the MIT Instrumentation Lab, which developed the on-flight software for the Apollo space program, and that is the very well-known picture of her standing next to the source code, and that scene is immortalized in Lego, which I think is probably, I would like to be immortalized in Lego more than I would like to win a Nobel Prize or anything. So she's one of that. I don't have the Lego set, unfortunately, because they were limited edition. But anyway, yeah, there she is, and you know that was when it was actually called out as software engineering division. And just in case people aren't aware, Apollo 11 put Neil Armstrong and company on the moon. So developer, the term developer, as far as I can tell, it first became from the APDA, the Apple Programmers and Developers Association, which came out of Cornell in the early 80s. But the term programmer was mainly used until Microsoft brought out the Microsoft Developer Network, which was launched in 1992. Now, I mean, as I said, my father was a developer at that time, so I remember they used to bring home, you know, huge books of CD-ROMs in those, you know, little folder things, and on there were kind of sample code, software development kit, tech articles, and stuff like that. MSDN, of course, isn't a thing these days, but it's all on the internet, as everything appears to be. So I think that's when the term developer really took off. And as I say, early 90s, it really began to take off as the main term for people who write code rather than the word programmer. So as I say, I would base that on conversations with family who were in the industry at the time. So my dad, I mean, when I wrote this presentation, he was still around then. So we had a discussion, and that's what he told me. And then the USA government has a book called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And before the early 90s, software engineering and computer programmers appeared to be used as distinct terms. And then you can see a shift away from the terms programmer to engineer around those words, around that time. And then so for example, in the mid-90s, the number of jobs for computer programmers fell by 3%, whereas the number of jobs for computer software engineers rose by 32%. And a couple of years after that, software developer appears. So what caused the shift? I mean, this is kind of where it's kind of completely my opinion, and so it could be wrong, and so feel free to disagree with everything I'm about to say, but hopefully not so much, but we'll see. So one thing that I noticed is around the time Developer was first used, there was a shift from CLI programs to GUI programs. So obviously that's a CLI thing, that's a GUI type thing. CLI stands for I can't remember what CLI, computer line interface, computer. I've had a complete brain fart there. Never mind. And GUI, graphical user interface, right? Probably command line interface for CLI. Anyway, so why do I think this is important? So feasibly, GUI programs can only really be built by the use of frameworks. I would dare anyone to try to write a browser, for example, in just pure C++ or C or anything like that with no frameworks or UI toolkits or anything like that. If anyone can, send it to me. Thank you very much. Command line interface. Cheers. Brain fart there. Yeah, if anyone can do that, send me the source code, and if it's true, I'll send you a Snickers bar. I think that's only fair. But GUI programming is a lot more complex, I would argue. So examples: Xlib, which has been in Linux since 1984, the Macintosh system software since 1984, all GUI-based stuff. The Windows API is a framework that obviously lets you show a window on screen. You don't have to write the code to handle what happens when this is clicked, what happens when it's maximized, what happens when it's minimized, and everything like that. There's also Qt, some people pronounce it Qt, which is a platform independent UI framework. And then obviously you've got others like Gem, GNOME, KDE, basically kind of frameworks and tools that let you build visual stuff pretty easy. So my theory is that the process of creating software became more about using libraries and interfacing between your code and library calls, which means you could concentrate more on the problem to actually solve, as opposed to represent to kind of work out how you're going to show it on screen. So of course this meant that software could evolve and become more complex and do more stuff. It could actually concentrate on what some, including myself, might call the fun bits of software engineering, you know, doing all the logic. So instead of using a widget, you basically use one that somebody else wrote. So I would propose that at that point, creating software became more abstract, encapsulated in the classic sense of the word, not necessarily the OOP sense. So I just mean that the code that you write doesn't actually care about how the framework you're interacting with works. It's just like draw a button here. So in the present, I would argue the different terms, programmer, developer, so on and so forth, I take them to mean slightly different things. So to me, a programmer is somebody who just writes code, who possibly writes all the code in the system, probably uses only very low-level stuff. Whereas I would say a developer is someone who thinks about the software development life cycle. You know, whether that be waterfall, which, you know, still makes me cry, or an agile-based thing. So I would argue that a developer probably only writes the application-specific code and probably uses libraries as much as possible for good reasons, because software these days is so complex. Why on earth would you want to write some code that makes you a wheel, say, when you can just grab a library off the shelf? This can be taken too far sometimes. See something like Node.js, where you go to create a new app and it pulls down like a billion different dependencies, but that's a story for another day. So I say there's potentially more other terms going around right now too. So as I say, I touched on software engineer before. So I would argue that this might be somebody who applies software engineering principles to creating software. So the solid principles, considering future requirements, consistency, stuff like that. Probably only writes application logic code, but dips into lower stuff as needed. Probably uses libraries as much as possible. And considers another level of abstraction, so how the software fits into other entities. So kind of like a little bit of forethought. Then you've got a software architect. So when I originally wrote this, I said to me this is more of a DevOps role, but actually I disagree with that now. I think the software architect is somebody who kind of takes a step back and sees the bigger picture. Might do a little bit of coding, but in a very complex software system, you might have a number of components, such as microservice working together. A development team might only be interested in looking after one of those microservices. So a software architect kind of takes the bigger view and says, well, for this software product to work, these different microservices have to work this way. And solve problems by using and administering these systems. Again, I disagree with that since I wrote it. But I mean, I think that's the reason I've kept that in there is it's a useful point to me, because I think it shows that these terms do kind of change over time, whether that's because the role has actually changed or my understanding of the role has changed. I think it's still a useful point to make. It's become a popular term since the advent of cloud computing. I mean, I would agree with that to an extent, because cloud computing makes it very, very easy to build very complex microservice-based architectures, especially when you look at Kubernetes and stuff like that. Is if you want to spin up a new, group of microservices that self-repair and stuff, you just spin up a new cluster, chuck in a container, and away you go. Whereas in the old days, it was a bit more difficult. So here's another thing. Does the term matter? It's probably not that important. But what I would say is slightly different roles suit slightly different people. So somebody who deals with customers directly is probably more of a developer than a programmer. This suggests that with developers, software skills are as important as technical skills. So there was a developer that I worked with, his job title was developer quite a few jobs ago, who was very much the hardcore programmer. I'd say he just kind of gets his head down, churns out code. The code's of good quality, but you kind of have to steer him in the right direction. So that's what I mean by that. Are any job roles better than the others? I mean, it kind of depends on the circumstances and the requirements. So it's useful to have a mix in a team, right? And I think that software teams are what I'm kind of working on right now to set up, and it's a very, very interesting thing, because when you go to set up a team, you kind of have a think about what skills you need and who can bring what. So perhaps if you can and if you want to, kind of have a bit of self-reflection time to kind of think about which one you think you are. I mean, it's entirely for you to decide. It's a constantly evolving industry. You don't feel you have to put yourself in a box. This is just my opinion based on what I've seen in my career so far. Please feel free to completely tell me I'm completely wrong and that I'm an idiot and don't know anything. That's absolutely fine. I would say that the role can and probably will change as you work through your career. So when I began, I was very much more of a programmer. I just wanted to kind of write code, keep my head down. But then I got more into the kind of software developer side, where I like to know about the life cycle and everything like that. So yeah, things have shifted there, I think. So to summarize, making computers do things has a long history. The terms apply to people who make computers do things has evolved over the years. New technology can cause a shift in how software is created, and therefore the types of skills of those people who work in the industry. Teams are ideally made out of different types of people. Different teams have different needs. So I would encourage you to be yourself and choose the path that you want to take. And that is it from me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'll open the floor up for people to ask questions. If you raise a hand, clap hands, I saw that. If you raise your hand, I will invite you to ask some questions or raise your own thoughts. I was just looking. I was writing some bits down. I found it very interesting. And some of it quite informative, actually.
Oh, good. I'm
And
glad.
bizarrely, Chris, as you were raising it, your MSDN folders, I've got a set on my bookcase from about 15, 20 years ago, but I still use them from time to time.
Well, yeah,
So,
that's the thing. Like I've still got ones because I had TechNet like a decade ago, and there's still a lot of useful stuff in them. So
it is, particularly on some of the older kit I've got here. So, right then, looking at the thing here, Ian, open to you, and you're on mute.
Thanks, John, and thanks ever so much, Chris. I thought that was
Welcome.
fascinating. So many congratulations from me. I really love that.
Thank you.
So for me, I just got a couple of comments or observations, if you like.
Sure.
So I'm more analyst than programmer, certainly more analyst. And my current role is information security. So I work with a whole bunch of devs. Sorry to be so generalistic. They're all called developers.
Yeah.
They're writing a whole load of code, and they're definitely more developers looking at code executed and maintained across systems, plural.
Yeah.
And one of the things with my role is information security. It's all around data protection, cyber security. So my guys, or I shouldn't say my guys, the developers that are around me have also got additional responsibilities for things like data protection by design and default.
Yeah.
So their skills are, there's additional things going on for developers here all around cyber and data protection.
Yeah.
And they've also got stuff, and I'm going to read this off my list here. OWASP. So these are all the vulnerability critiques to be writing good secure code. And all of our stuff is vulnerability scanned all day, all night, weekly, and so on. So I'll throw that in as a bit of a critique from where I'm working, if that's helpful for you.
Yeah, no, that's really good, because kind of that kind of role, a much more security facing role, is one that I will, quite frankly concede I've got no experience with at all. So I mean, I've done a lot of stuff, but nothing to do with kind of security, other than the usual thing of, if you're a web dev, you look for XSS attacks and that kind of thing. But the actual hardcore security stuff that you've done, as I say, I have no experience of. So that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I mean, the last thing I'll probably add for the whole audience actually is, when you're the considerations of secure development is actually a legal requirement as GDPR. And if you look at the Information Commissioner's website, it's called Data Protection by Design and Default. It's actually just good code. It's just really good principles. Depending on what role, what context your business is in, you might find it's a legal thing you have to do at the very beginning of your life cycle. So our DevOps work items are configured around data protection and data privacy at the beginning of the life cycle.
Yeah. So I mean, most of the stuff that I've done has been kind of like internal stuff or APIs that were restricted in some other way. So I mean, I've not had exposure, but I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a area that I find fascinating and I'd love to learn more about. It's just a case of so many hours in the day.
Type need a few more hours then. And actually, and I said to my last thing, it adds to their work. They've got enough to do writing good code, and then I come along and say, right, well, you've got data protection and cyber and OWASP and vulnerability perspective. So it adds to a busy day, and it's actually a good thing because their skills and their pay is rather elevated because there's pretty good developers. So that's me. That's a nice one to pop in.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Chris. Thank you.
Paul, I see you got your hand up.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Chris. That was excellent talk.
Thank you very much.
I've just got a couple of points.
Sure.
The first one is with architecture, because I finished off my career as an architect, and I think there's so many different types of architect. So your first thoughts could well have been right, depending on what type of architect you were thinking of, because there's software architecture, there's solution architecture, there's technical architect, systems architect, enterprise architect, and so on. There's a whole plethora of them, and they're all concerned with different goals. As regards programmer and developer, the way that I look at this is that I think a programmer is almost like a subset of a developer, because if you look back far enough. As you said, with command line interfaces, the programmer, there wasn't a lot of human HCI involved at all, and
Yeah.
there are so many concerns that a software developer has today that going back 30, 40 years ago, a programmer didn't. So you've had to pick up all these different things, even things like basic things like source code repositories. There wasn't a lot of that. Working in teams, being able to interact with people. There's so many, planning the workload. All this now is the normal sort of part of a developer's workload and concern. And programming, if I may, perhaps, I don't know if people are like this, perhaps is only perhaps less than half the job of a developer these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with that to an extent. I'd say that the way that I would think about it is your day to day. Sometimes you might have a day of just where you write code. That to me would be a very, very good day, by the way. But then there are other days where you need to do more administrative-y things and kind of less coding things. But yeah, I agree in principle. Yeah, definitely.
Good. I see Ian's hand still up, but I'm assuming he hasn't put it down. Any other questions from anyone? Wow, Chris, I think I get away with this. Oh, here we go.
Oh, no.
Irene.
I've put something in the chat.
Yes.
Possibly more of a comment for John than for you. I don't know. It's made me think. The name of the institution. It's got the words analysts and programmers in it. And what I've said there, could this be off-putting to those who consider themselves to be developers or software engineers? Could they think, well, this is not for me?
It's funny you should say that, Irene. Not this. We have monthly executive team meetings, which Paul and myself, Alistair and Graham get together. And this did come up, I think, not this month, but August, where it would be, so July. And we actually did discuss this. It does raise its head. We do have lots of software engineers who are members. We have testers. We have the full range in reality.
Yes.
Particularly in the days when you have like DevOps teams where you've got the full range of people in the DevOps team. Basically, they could all be members because they will generally fit the bill. So it's something we're aware of. It's like app developers. Are you a developer if you've developed an app, which is generally done on an online framework for a lot of people, unless you're like myself, who's a bit more hardcore and develops it locally. But they don't fit the IAP model. And you can have an app that's written by somebody who's never coded before, and it sells 1 million copies at 99p, and they're very rich and they've never coded before and they may never code again. So it's quite complicated now in what is a developer. I think I would use the word professional developer.
Well,
but at what point do you become a professional?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Actually, Microsoft are beginning to bring out the slightly new idea, something which they refer to as a citizen developer. So that's using something like Power Apps, which is a no-code or very low-code kind of drag and drop thing. And in Azure, you've got Logic Apps, which is again basically a drag and drop thing. So should they be included in this? I mean, probably not, but kind of. It is really, really hard. But I mean, this is part of the reason that I love the software industry so much, because it evolves all the time. It never stands still. And I think that it's very right that we are having these kind of discussions and thinking about this. And it might well be the case that there is somebody who only has that experience, but actually has still done something kind of good enough to still be thought of as a developer. I don't know. It's just fun and exciting to think about, I think.
In the
Thanks.
50 years of the IAP, we weren't called the IAP originally, it was the, I want to say the University Computing Club or something. It started out. I should know this off by heart, but I will do for the next webinar because that's our 50th anniversary one. So we are looking at it, Irene. I don't know if we've got an answer for it, but it's the industry has changed and we are looking at that.
Thank you.
Ben.
Hi, I had a question, which might end up being like the topic of another webinar, but you've outlined, the difference between developers and software engineers and software architects, which I thought was really interesting. But what would you say is perhaps the difference between a developer or a software engineer and a computer scientist?
So I think it comes down to the difference between engineering and science. And to me, an engineer has a known problem that you're trying to solve and comes up with an idea and puts things in place to try to solve that specific problem. Whereas a scientist has a hypothesis and tries to prove or disprove that hypothesis. So it's a slightly different thing. To me, an engineer has a real world thing they're trying to solve. Scientist has an idea that may or may not be the case, and they're trying to prove or disprove that. So to me, like these days in the AI and ML world, you've got data scientists. So I think that's a prime example of that, where disclaimer: I'm not a data scientist or anything. I know enough about it to kind of help run a team, but that's about it, really. They literally have a hypothesis about insights they can get from a set of data, and then design experiments to see if they can prove or disprove that hypothesis. Whereas, as I say, an engineer to me has a specific problem they're trying to solve, and then puts in steps and comes up with ideas to do that. Does that answer your question as to what I think?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, Chris, if you could just turn your video off, much as I like your face. See if we've got any more
There you go.
questions from anyone else.
No questions.
Lovely.
I've stunned everybody into silence, eh?
But it's quite interesting, the bit about the roles of scientist, software engineer, or just whether you're a developer, that things have moved a long way. The technology of 50 years ago was, yes, a long time back. Paul, I see you got your hand back up.
Yes. I'm looking to the future now, Chris. That was a very interesting presentation. At the last webinar we had, we got into talking about your strategy of trying to hide primitives when passing parameters, and you thought about perhaps you could do a webinar on that. That would be very interesting.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because it's one that John and I have already discussed. It is being planned. To be honest, I've not had a lot of time recently because I've just changed jobs, but it is definitely on the kind of back burner of something to do. I mean, there's a couple that we've discussed. So yeah, that's definitely on there. We
are looking at one about women in computing, aren't we, Chris?
Yes, because there's one that I did. So in my last job, it was for I worked for a small company that was owned by a very large corporation in the States, and this company in the States is very keen to try to get more women in tech, which is a thing I'm passionate about as well, because, as I've said before, software is just such an intrinsic part of our lives. If you want it to be available and useful for and representative for the whole world, I think it is a moral and ethical issue to have as diverse a team as you can, and of course part of that is women in tech. So I mean, it was really brought home to me because I'm a STEM ambassador as well. If you're not sure what that is, it's basically people who work in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, who kind of go into schools and say, yeah, STEM careers are great, join STEM, we need you, it's great, kind of thing, which is. And so I went to one for an all-girls school, and these girls just had no idea that they could go into a career in software engineering or anything at all. So I felt really bad about that. So I came back, did a bit of research, and found the top 5 reasons that women say that they don't feel they can have a career in tech. And basically, my presentation is ripping that to shreds. So I gave the presentation at it's called the We at Hearst group, which is women employees at Hearst or something like that. And it went down very, very well, I think. So that is definitely planned. But I think we agreed that we would kind of do that presentation at an appropriate time. So, like, for example, if there's a Women in Tech Week or something like that, then kind of try to aim it for then.
That'd be quite good. I think that's sometime in November, which we're going to try.
I see. And Claire's just popped something really, really interesting into the chat, saying that as a woman, she'd probably feel more comfortable thinking of herself as a developer and engineer rather than a programmer. As sometimes, you know, programmer is a badge of honor worn by kind of young, you know, let's be honest, you know, young white men who like to play around with stuff. So, I mean, I would agree with that. I can definitely understand that, and I mean, it just goes to show how important names are. I mean, most of the kind of roles that I'm seeing these days are definitely advertised as developer roles rather than programming roles, and I think that speaks to the complexity of software development, and you know how you do need to have those kind of soft skills as well as those hardcore coding skills. But it's a really interesting point, Claire, thanks. And Chris, I think you're spot on. I think, you know, these days software is so complex, you do have to have some of the key soft skills that support development. So I would entirely agree.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. It has been very, very interesting. I can't see any more questions there.
Thank you.
I would say thank you very much for that. Thank you to everyone who's attended today. As I said, what I will do is it'll probably be mid-end late next week. I will edit this down a little bit. If everyone's not got a problem with the questions being asked, because obviously your names will appear for that. As long as if anyone's got a problem with that, just send me a quick email and I will chop that bit out. But I think there was a lot of good discussion as well there, and it would be nice to do that. And some I will upload this, and then I know of several people have already said they couldn't make the session, but they will watch it then on the catch up. So it literally is down to what time I've got over the weekend to edit this down, and I haven't at the moment. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I will be emailing you out in a little while anyway, but thank you very much.